The dust settled along Main Street as Arabella Nichols stared at the telegram clutched in her trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. Her father, gone swept away in a mining accident 3 states over, leaving her with nothing but debts and a one-way ticket to Williamsburg, Colorado. The year was 1876, and at 20 years old, she had just become entirely alone in the world. Last call for the evening stage to Williamsburg, the station master bellowed, eyeing Arabella's single carpet bag with something between pity and impatience. "I'm coming," she said, gathering her skirts and the last of her courage. Her aunt's letter had promised refuge and perhaps marriage prospects, though the latter made her stomach twist with unease. Her aunt's specific words still burned in her memory. "You have no dowry, girl, but you're pretty enough to catch someone's eye." The journey was punishing 2 days of bouncing over rutted trails, pressed between a minister's wife who reeked of mothballs and a salesman whose elbow seemed permanently lodged in her ribs. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Williamsburg, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the wooden storefronts. The town sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by mountains that pierced the sky like sentinels. "Miss, we've arrived," the driver said, offering his hand as she descended. "Williamsburg, not much to look at, but it's home to some." "Thank you," she murmured, scanning the dusty street. Her aunt's instructions had been clear: walk 3 blocks down, turn right at Holloway's General Store, and continue to the yellow house with white trim. She hadn't made it half a block when disaster struck. A group of cowboys burst from the saloon, one colliding with her so forcefully that her carpet bag spilled open, scattering her meager possessions across the muddy street. "I beg your pardon, madam," the cowboy slurred, swaying slightly before his friends dragged him away, leaving her to scramble for her belongings as the evening stage departed in a cloud of dust. A shadow fell across her as she reached for her mother's silver hairbrush, now splattered with mud. A worn leather boot stepped carefully around it, and a tanned hand reached down to retrieve it before she could. "Looks like you could use some help, miss." His voice was deep, with a gentle lilt that suggested he wasn't native to these parts. Arabella looked up, squinting against the setting sun that haloed the tall figure. "I can manage," she said stiffly, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "I'm sure you can," he replied, crouching to her level. Now she could see his face weathered by sun and wind, but kind, with eyes the color of summer storms. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. He handed her the brush, and she noticed the careful way his calloused fingers avoided touching hers. "A gentleman, then, despite his rough appearance. Xavier Morgan," he introduced himself, helping gather her scattered clothes. "Most folks call me Xav." "Arabella Nichols," she replied, hastily stuffing a nightgown back into her bag, mortified that a stranger was handling her personal items. "I've just arrived to stay with my aunt, Martha Nichols. Do you know her?" A shadow passed over his face. "I do," he said carefully, "but I'm afraid I have some news that might not be welcome." Arabella's heart sank. "What is it?" "Your Aunt Martha passed away 3 weeks ago." "Influenza took her quick." Xavier's voice was gentle but direct. "I'm sorry, I thought someone would have sent word." The world tilted beneath her feet, and she might have fallen had Xavier not caught her elbow. "But that can't be right. I received her letter only a month ago inviting me to come." "The sickness swept through town fast," he explained. "Half the valley was down with it before the doctor from Denver even arrived." Arabella sank onto her bag, mind reeling. Her last connection, her final hope gone before she'd even arrived. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Xavier hesitated, then offered his hand. "Let me take you to Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. She's got rooms for young ladies, and she could use the company." Having no alternative, Arabella accepted his help. As they walked, Xavier carried her bag and pointed out landmarks: the general store, the church, the small schoolhouse. "Town's growing," he said. "Railroads coming through next year, they say. And what do you do here, Mr. Morgan?" She asked, trying to focus on something besides her dire circumstances. "I've got a small ranch about 3 miles out," he replied. "Nothing fancy, but the cattle are healthy and the land's paid for." There was quiet pride in his voice, the confidence of a man who had built something with his own hands. Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house was a neat two-story building with geraniums in the window boxes. The older woman who answered the door had silver hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Another one?" she asked Xavier, looking Arabella up and down. "This is Miss Nichols, Mrs. Whittaker, Martha's niece from back east. She just learned about her aunt's passing." Mrs. Whittaker's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your lost child. Martha was a good woman, despite her sharp tongue." "Thank you," Arabella managed. I need a room if you have one, and perhaps you know of any work available. I don't have much money, but I'm willing to work hard." Mrs. Whittaker exchanged a look with Xavier. "I've got a room," she said finally, "and as for work, we'll figure something out. Come on in." Xavier set down her bag. "I'll leave you in Mrs. Whittaker's capable hands. If you need anything, Miss Nichols, you can usually find me at the Mercantile on Saturday mornings." Before she could properly thank him, he tipped his hat and was gone, boots echoing on the wooden porch steps. The room was small but clean: a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair beneath a window that overlooked the back garden. Mrs. Whittaker explained the house rules: no gentlemen visitors, breakfast at 6 sharp, church on Sundays, then left Arabella to unpack her few possessions. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, Arabella finally allowed herself to cry for her father, for her aunt, for the future that seemed to be crumbling around her. When dawn broke, she splashed cold water on her swollen eyes, pinned her hair up neatly, and went downstairs determined to face whatever came next. What came next was work hard, honest work that left her hands raw and her back aching. Mrs. Whittaker arranged for her to help at the dressmaker's shop 3 days a week, where Arabella's fine stitching earned grudging praise from Mrs. Peterson, the owner. The other 2 days she spent cleaning at the doctor's office, trying not to flinch when patients came in with injuries that reminded her of her father's mining accidents. The weeks passed, and slowly Williamsburg began to feel less foreign. She recognized faces on the street, received nods of acknowledgement at church. Mrs. Whittaker proved to be fair if stern, and the other 2 boarders, a young widow named Clara and a schoolteacher called Miss Evans, became something like friends. She saw Xavier Morgan occasionally on the street, at church, once at the general store where he was buying supplies. Each time he tipped his hat politely and asked after her welfare. Each time she felt a curious warmth spread through her chest at his attention. It was a Tuesday in late October when disaster struck again. Arabella was walking back from the doctor's office, her mind on the approaching winter and whether her threadbare coat would suffice, when she heard shouting. Looking up, she saw flames leaping from the roof of Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. She ran, joining the bucket line that had already formed. For 3 frantic hours, the townspeople fought the blaze, but by nightfall, it was clear the boarding house was beyond saving. No lives were lost, thank Providence, but everything inside, including all of Arabella's possessions, had been reduced to ash. The town rallied, finding temporary shelter for the displaced women. Clara went to stay with her late husband's family, Miss Evans with the minister's family. And Arabella found herself sitting in the back room of the dressmaker's shop, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, wondering what cruel fate kept stripping away every new beginning. "Miss Nichols." She looked up to find Xavier Morgan standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking strangely hesitant. "Mr. Morgan," she acknowledged, hastily wiping her eyes. "I heard about the fire," he said, stepping inside. "I'm truly sorry. Seems like more than your fair share of trouble has found you since coming to Williamsburg." A harsh laugh escaped her. "That's putting it mildly." He shifted his weight, glancing around the small room with its bolts of fabric and half-finished dresses. "I've got a proposition for you, if you'll hear it." Wariness crept up her spine. She'd already received 2 propositions from men in town, one from the widowed blacksmith who needed someone to mind his 4 children, and one from the saloon owner who'd eyed her figure appreciatively while offering a job that made her cheeks burn. "What sort of proposition?" "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, is getting on in years. Her daughter's expecting a baby in Sacramento, and she's planning to leave next week to help out." He twisted his hat brim in his hands. "The ranch needs looking after, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." There's a small cabin behind the main house. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." Arabella studied him, searching for any hint of impropriety, but found only earnest concern. "People would talk," she said finally. "They always do," he agreed. "But Mrs. Abernathy would be there for the first week to show you the ropes, and my ranch hands live in the bunkhouse, well away from the main house. Your reputation would be safe." She thought of her alternatives, imposing on the charity of virtual strangers or trying to secure another boarding house room with money she didn't have. "When would I start?" Relief washed over his face. "Tomorrow, if you're able. I can come by with the wagon around noon." And so it was that Arabella found herself bouncing along a rutted trail the next day, her new possessions, donated by townswomen, packed in a crate beside her. Xavier drove the wagon, pointing out landmarks and explaining about his land. "It's not the biggest spread," he told her, pride evident in his voice. "About 400 acres, mostly grazing land. I run about 100 head of cattle, plus some horses. The house was here when I bought the place, built it up some over the years. How long have you been here?" She asked, genuinely curious about this man who had shown her nothing but kindness. 7 years, he replied. "Came west after the war with whatever I could carry and worked as a hand until I saved enough for a down payment on this place. You fought in the war." She studied his profile, trying to imagine him in a uniform. "Union cavalry," he said shortly, and something in his tone told her not to press further. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide porch and smoke rising from the chimney. Behind it sat a smaller cabin, a stable, and further back, a bunkhouse. Pastures stretched in all directions, dotted with cattle, and beyond them, mountains rose against the sky. "It's beautiful," Arabella said sincerely. Xavier's expression softened. "It is at that, Mrs. Abernathy proved to be a no-nonsense woman of about 60 who eyed Arabella with frank assessment before nodding. "You'll do," she declared, as if Arabella had passed some invisible test. "You look like you're not afraid of hard work." The next week was a whirlwind of learning how to manage the temperamental cook stove, where supplies were kept, which ranch hands needed extra portions at mealtimes, and Xavier's preferences, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, shirts starched lightly but not too stiff. Mrs. Abernathy was a demanding teacher but a thorough one, and by the time she departed for Sacramento, Arabella felt reasonably confident in her new role. Xavier was often gone from sunup to sundown, working with his men, but they shared breakfast and supper each day. Initially, their conversation was stilted, limited to the practicalities of running the household. But gradually, as autumn deepened toward winter, they began to share more of themselves. She learned he'd grown up in Virginia, the youngest son of a moderately prosperous family. The war had taken his father and older brother, and afterward, with the family fortune decimated, he'd headed west rather than watch his mother struggle to maintain appearances. He sent money home regularly, but had not returned east in 7 years. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines, and the itinerant life that followed as they moved from one mining camp to another. She spoke of her mother's death from pneumonia when Arabella was 16, and her father's increasing desperation as each new mine failed to yield the riches he sought. "He always believed the next claim would be the one," she said one evening as they sat by the fire after supper. "He died still believing it. Hope can be a powerful thing," Xavier commented, staring into the flames. "Sometimes it's all that keeps a person going." "And sometimes it blinds you to reality," she countered, thinking of all the opportunities her father had passed up in pursuit of his elusive fortune. Winter settled over the valley, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland. The work was hard, hauling water, chopping wood, keeping the house warm and the ranch hands fed, but Arabella found a rhythm to it, a satisfaction in honest labor that yielded tangible results. Christmas approached, and with it came a tenderness between them that neither acknowledged directly. Xavier began finding reasons to stay in the house after supper, a ledger that needed attention, a book he was reading. Arabella found herself taking extra care with her appearance, even though it was foolish given her position. On Christmas Eve, she was startled when Xavier appeared at the kitchen door holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I'm heading into town for some supplies," he said. "Thought you might like to come along." The town was festive, with pine boughs decorating storefronts and candles glowing in windows. They completed Xavier's errands, then he surprised her by suggesting they stay for the Christmas Eve service at the church. The little white church was packed, warm with bodies and candlelight. Sitting beside Xavier in the pew, hearing his deep voice join in the familiar carols, Arabella felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. It had been so long since she'd belonged anywhere, been part of something that felt like home. After the service, as they drove back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "Why did you help me? That first day in town and then after the fire, you didn't know me." Xavier was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "When I first came west, I was as lost as you looked that day. A man named Turner gave me a chance, hired me when others wouldn't because of my accent, taught me ranching. Let me work until I'd saved enough to start on my own." He glanced at her. "Sometimes all a person needs is someone to believe they're worth a chance." Back at the ranch, he walked her to the cabin door. "I almost forgot," he said, pulling the small package from his coat pocket. "Merry Christmas, Arabella." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a peculiar thrill through her. Inside the package was a small silver brooch, simple but elegant, a forget-me-not flower with a tiny pearl at its center. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched beyond words. "It reminded me of you," he said simply, then cleared his throat. "Good night, Miss Nichols." Winter gave way to spring, and with it came changes to the ranch. A telegram brought word that Mrs. Abernathy had decided to remain in Sacramento permanently, where her new grandson had captured her heart. Xavier didn't mention finding a replacement, and Arabella didn't bring it up. One evening in early April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Xavier suddenly asked, "Are you happy here, Arabella?" The question caught her off guard. "I am," she replied honestly. "Happier than I expected to be," he nodded, seeming relieved. "Good, that's good." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. Then Xavier spoke again, his voice careful. "The town's been talking." Her heart sank. Of course they had been. A single woman living on a bachelor's ranch, even in a separate cabin, was bound to set tongues wagging. "What are they saying?" "Nothing specific," he assured her quickly. "But Mrs. Patterson from the general store made a point of asking me about my intentions when I was in town yesterday." Despite her anxiety, Arabella couldn't help but laugh. "And what did you tell her?" "That my intentions were my own business," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Then his expression grew serious. "But it got me thinking about the future, about what I want." The air between them suddenly seemed charged with possibility. "And what is it you want, Xavier?" He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intent on hers. "I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper, but as—" He faltered, then straightened his shoulders. "I'm not a poetic man, Arabella. I can't offer pretty words or grand gestures, but I can offer you a home and my heart if you'll have it." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I have nothing to bring to a marriage," she whispered. "No dowry, no family connections, nothing but myself." Xavier reached out, taking her hand in his. "You have no dowry but your heart," he said softly, "and that's more than most men ever earn in a lifetime." The simplicity of his words, the earnest truth of them, broke something open inside her. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes, I'll stay." Their wedding took place on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers blanketing the meadows around the ranch. The entire town turned out, the same people who had gossiped now bringing wedding gifts and well wishes. Mrs. Whittaker, rebuilding her boarding house, cried openly during the ceremony. Even Mrs. Peterson from the dressmaker's shop unbent enough to gift Arabella with a beautiful wedding gown of cream-colored silk. That evening, alone together for the first time as husband and wife, Xavier took her hands in his. "I have something for you," he said, leading her to his study. From the desk drawer, he withdrew a leather folder and handed it to her. Inside was a deed to the ranch, now listing both their names. "It's yours too now," he explained. If anything happens to me, you'll never have to worry about having a home again." Arabella stared at the document, overcome. All her life, security had been as elusive as her father's silver strikes. And now this man, this good, honorable man, had given her not just his heart, but a future she could count on. "I don't know what to say," she managed finally. Xavier drew her into his arms. "You don't need to say anything. Just stay." And she did, through the seasons that followed, through the joys and challenges of ranch life, through the birth of their son the following spring. They named him Thomas after her father, and he grew strong and curious, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years after Thomas came their daughter, Elizabeth, with a shock of red hair and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. Xavier built an addition to the house as their family grew, and Arabella planted a garden that became the envy of the valley. The railroad came to Williamsburg as predicted, bringing growth and prosperity to the town. Xavier's careful management expanded the ranch to nearly 1,000 acres, and his breeding stock became known throughout the territory. But for all their increasing comfort, they remained the same at heart, working side by side, teaching their children the value of hard work and honest living. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised her with a trip back east to visit his aging mother, yes, but also to show her the places he'd known as a boy. Standing on the shores of the Chesapeake, watching the sunset paint the water gold, he slipped his arm around her waist. "Any regrets?" he asked. Arabella leaned into his solid warmth, thinking of the uncertain girl who had arrived in Williamsburg with nothing but a carpet bag and fading hope. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "Nor I," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best investment I ever made, taking a chance on a girl with no dowry but her heart." She laughed, turning in his arms. "And has it paid dividends, Mr. Morgan?" "Beyond measure, Mrs. Morgan," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. "Beyond measure." Years later, when their children were grown and starting families of their own, Arabella found Xavier on the porch one evening, watching a new generation play in the yard. She sat beside him, her hand finding his by familiar habit. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That day you arrived in town," he admitted. "How close I came to just tipping my hat and walking past." "But you didn't," she reminded him. "Best decision I ever made," he said, squeezing her hand. Proving once again that the richest man isn't the one with the most in his pockets, but the most in his heart. And as the sun set over the land they had nurtured together, Arabella knew he was right. She had come to Williamsburg with nothing but herself to offer, and found a man who recognized that as treasure enough. Together they had built something neither could have created alone, not just a prosperous ranch or a growing family, but a life woven with threads of respect, partnership, and enduring love. It was, indeed, more than most ever earned in a lifetime.